And welcome to the Q&A podcast. I'm your host, Peter Slen. Thanks for joining us. This week, we talk with Lee Bollinger, who spent nearly 20 years as president of Columbia University. Our conversation begins in a moment. Lee Bollinger is the longtime former president of Columbia University. Prior to that, he was president of the University of Michigan. Now, he's written a book titled University: A Reckoning. In the book, he advocates for the role of the university in today's society. He also discusses some of the free speech issues and structural changes confronting America's colleges today. Our conversation begins now. And joining us now on C-SPAN is Lee Bollinger, who spent 21 years as president of Columbia University, 6 years prior to that at the University of Michigan. President Bollinger, what does a university president do?
That's a very good question. So university presidents, it's a wonderful job. To me, it's one of the best jobs in the world. And the reason is primarily because you're with an institution that is dedicated to discovering new knowledge and to preserving knowledge and to educating young people. And there's great integrity in these institutions, and so you're part of something that is really very special and very noble. And the university's president's job is to make sure that that mission is done with excellence and consistent with academic values, and performs the great role we expect of universities in the society. So that's my overview of what a president does.
Well, in your book, University: A Reckoning, you write that the university is one of the most successful institutions in American and perhaps human history. Almost everything good in our modern existence can be traced in some way to work done in our academic institutions. This is well worth repeating over and over again. In those 21 years at Columbia, what do you think you got right?
Well, I think, Columbia is one of the great universities, academic institutions in the world. It has an incredible faculty and brilliant students who come from all over the world as well, but primarily from the United States. If I think about my time, both as president of Columbia and of Michigan, my hope is that I helped to advance that mission. There are many things that we did in my time. Among them, to create one of the foremost centers for study of the brain and neuroscience in the world, but also to make sure that students had full access to, all of the array of knowledge that the university has to offer, including understanding a very, very complex global world. We tried to open up opportunities for people to come to Columbia by preserving scholarly aid for students who come from low-income families. We established a policy that if your family made less $60,000 or less a year, you would come free to Columbia. We also did a lot to advance diversity within the student body, but also within the faculty and the institution. There are many, many things that I could point to, but those are really, I think, among the major achievements.
What frustrated you? What feels undone?
I think you always feel that there's more to do. Again, I go back to where I started. Universities are about knowledge, and every faculty member has a field. Every faculty member is expected and wants to try to advance knowledge in that field. Every student who is brought in to the institution, we need to help educate that person and bring them into the research enterprise as well as the teaching enterprise. you need incredible things to do this. You need laboratories, you need scholarships, you need research funds, you need the opportunities for faculty to learn about the world so that they can, write better books and perform this function of advancing knowledge in the society. And my belief is that, as I say in the quote that you referred to, uh, almost everything great in modern society can be traced back to discoveries in laboratories and research by faculty in the humanities, social sciences. And when you have that potential in a university to really help society, you're always going to end up feeling that you could have done more, and so that's the way I felt.
President Bollinger, are the revolutions in information and technology changing the role of the university from 10 years ago, 20, 50 years ago?
So this is a very interesting question, Peter. I think one has to again start with this: how do we understand the world, both humans in it and the natural world. And this really requires very, very close, um, very strong efforts to try to understand everything that has been thought and done and said about these areas of life and the natural world, and to try to figure out how we can improve our knowledge. And when people are engaged in this, uh, they are really bringing everything they can to bear on it. Information technology, computers, these have been enormously important to advancing research and enormously important to advancing teaching. But the core of what happens in a university, I think, is really captured by a little anecdote I use in the book that came from a faculty member I admired many, many years ago, who was walking on a campus and passed a faculty member listening to a student talk about something serious, obviously. And the faculty member, just as my friend walked by, said to the student, "But have you considered?" Meaning, we are constantly trying to open up our minds to new possibilities, to ideas that haven't been considered before. And information technology can help with that, but it cannot replace it. So, my answer, Peter, is that uh, information technology has been a great advance, but it will hopefully, I don't think ever can, replace the community of people living in a physical environment with the norms and the ethos of discovery of knowledge and the human interactions that are essential to that pursuit. So, um, that in the press, for example, there's been a very serious erosion of press institutions, traditional press, traditional media, because the internet and the information technology revolution have undermined the business model of these institutions of the press. I think it's notable that this has not happened with universities. Uh, this is something that I think cannot be replaced. It cannot be replicated in a digital world. It can be helped, as I said, and you can learn a lot through the new information universe that we have. But that educational mission and that discovery mission happens best in an environment that we have created that we call a university. And that's one of the things I really want to emphasize in this book. It is a great achievement and must not be taken lightly.
Do you worry about the advent of artificial technology or artificial intelligence?
So I'm not an expert in artificial intelligence, and I simply, am both a consumer of it to a certain extent, but also a reader and a listener to what people have to say about this. Again, my view is that if anybody says that the discovery process and the educational process of universities as we've come to know them will be and can be replaced by artificial intelligence, I think that's naive. I think it doesn't really reflect an understanding of what happens on a university campus and throughout higher education. So I'm not worried that artificial intelligence will replace universities. Um, I certainly think it should not, and we would be poor if it did. So, but I'm also of the view that this can help enormously. So, if all the information, all the ideas in the world are more available to people, not only people who spend 4 years in college and maybe more years in graduate school, if all that information and knowledge can be accessible to people generally, that strikes me as a great human advance. So I'm optimistic in that sense. I just don't think it can replace the university as we have come to develop it and see it.
President Bollinger, you retired in 2023 from Columbia as president, but you are still Professor Bollinger, aren't you?
That's right.
What do you teach?
So I teach a First Amendment class, freedom of speech and press, in the law school to law students, just as I did when I began teaching, over a half century ago. And I teach First Amendment class, the same class, to undergraduates, and there I have up to 200 students who take this class, and I enjoy both of them thoroughly. So that's what I do, and of course I write books.
Well, in your book, you talk about the fact that there are about 6,000 colleges in the United States, 70 of which are leading research universities. What's the difference?
Well, there's an approximate difference. So we think of universities as divided into certain categories. Every single university, from a community college up to one of the great research institutions, teaches students, and that's a remarkable thing and should not be ignored as a fact. Some countries have universities where there's teaching that goes on, and then they have research institutes where advancement of knowledge is takes place, and they're separate institutions. In the United States, we have combined them. I think that's a glorious outcome because it's the young people who come to a campus and who are brought into the full enterprise of trying to discover new truths and knowledge that really gives life to the place. And I personally love teaching students, and I think every faculty member does. That's a reason why you spend your life in these roles. So I mean, let me stop there, Peter. Ask more and I'll expand, but I don't want to go on too long on this.
Right. Let's go back to your book, University of Reckoning. Quote, you write that because of federal funds, universities have become too dependent on sources of income that create risks to the fundamental mission. What do you mean by that?
So this is of course the core issue at the moment. the government under the Trump administration, for the first time in modern history, is using federal funding of science and biomedical engineering types of research, is using that funding stream to gain control of universities. And this is a very, very serious matter, and I believe it is part of a broad authoritarian attack on institutions in American society. This is happening with respect to the press. It's happening with law firms, happening with business and elsewhere. But the United States after World War II realized that research, advancing knowledge, was really, really the core question for what countries were going to succeed in the modern world. There was enormous possibilities for finding out more about human beings, about societies, about the world, about the natural world. And the United States chose to pursue that mission by using its existing universities and colleges to do that. And so the funding mechanism was set up with very, very strong protections against government abuse and very strong ethos that academic peer evaluation should determine who were the recipients of these funds, and that system, primarily through two institutions, the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health, has been enormously successful. I mean, you just cannot, say too strongly how the United States' success as a country, our success as a nation, our success as a democracy hinges in significant part on the success of that government program aligned with universities to advance knowledge. Well, that funding has grown, and it's been a wonderful thing, as I said, but it made universities vulnerable because in a budget like that at Columbia, which may be an institution of this size, $5-6 billion a year, $1 billion of that would be coming from the federal government to support scientific endeavors, among others. What happened is that the government, wanting to really undermine American universities, has used that funding to say, we will no longer give you that funding unless you allow us to monitor your admissions and help to control your faculty appointments and eliminate your policies, such as those related to DEI and so on. And because the amounts of money for universities are so great, universities have said this is an existential trap we have been put in. And so that's what I mean by the vulnerability that has been created for academic autonomy, for freedom of the university, by the funding system that was set up in the post-World War II era.
And C-SPAN's Q&A podcast continues in a moment. But Professor Bollinger, isn't there some legitimacy to conservatives and the Trump administration's complaints about what they call woke and policies that are anti-conservative, especially when you look at faculty that's 85-90% on the liberal side? Isn't there some legitimacy to their concerns?
I think we have to separate out several things here. The answer, just very forthright, is that does not justify, in my view, the effort to take over universities. You have to unpack what it is that is being said about universities. Let me say again, none of it, in my view, even if credible, does not justify the authoritarian undermining of the autonomy and independence of thought within universities. That is a constitutional, in my view, principle, and it's a legal principle from laws that Congress has passed, and it's a matter of national norms. So one has to keep uh, those things separate. What justifies? Nothing can justify the government in that sort of intrusion, and not the criticisms that are launched. Then I think one can, once you've established that, you can talk about the criticisms. Many of them I would agree with. Many of them I think are right, but taken way out of proportion. And some of them I think are untrue. So let's take one. So there's a view that students on American campuses and some faculty in some departments have become intolerant towards ideas that are reasonable and happen to be opposed to their views, and that this kind of intolerance is especially unacceptable in a university campus. So my answer would be absolutely, it's inconsistent with a university campus, ethos of openness and open-mindedness and what I call a scholarly temperament, which I think is very special in universities, where we use reason to try to decide and think through what is right, what is to be discarded, what we should pursue. So the scholarly temperament says we use reason, we're open-minded. If the evidence is that our views are wrong, we change our minds. This extreme kind of openness in the university world, I think, is critical. And any type of intolerance where people say, I've made up my mind, I'm no longer going to listen to the opposing point of view. I think the opponents are immoral and wrong and so on. Uh, that's corrosive to the basic mission of the university and the things that make it so special. But then you have to ask, how deep does that go in universities? And by many critics, you would think that universities are just infected with this all across the institution. And in fact, that's simply not true. You can find instances, of course, where there has been uh, intolerance towards, for example, speakers. Speakers may have been shouted down or disinvited for, intolerant reasons. You can find examples of people debating on campuses and not showing proper respect for other people's ideas. You can find those, and every one of those, as I always say, is one too many. Uh, but they do not characterize a university in the United States. If you walk onto any campus, I think this is what I say in the book, because I've lived my life in campus. If you walk onto any campus, you go into any classroom, any laboratory, you go to lectures and speakers, you just don't find this. You find this scholarly temperament, this openness, this incredible exhilaration of thinking through problems and learning. And so the examples of intolerance are there. They're real, they're unacceptable, but they simply do not define the character of our institutions. For every single speaker who's disinvited inappropriately, there are dozens and dozens of controversial speakers who come to campuses, and there may be protests, but they're within the bounds of, expression of opposing ideas and completely within the bounds of academic open-mindedness. So I give that prime example as just a, we have to keep these things in proportion, and we cannot allow people to claim unfairly that the examples really represent the whole institutions.
One of the examples that you cite in your book is one you lived through in 2007. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad visited Colombia.
Yes, so this is a very good example, I think, of the principles of universities, the difficulties of living by those principles. The same is true of the First Amendment, which I'm sure we'll get to, Peter. But universities, uh, generally speaking, abide by the First Amendment. Choose to abide if you're a private university, must abide by the First Amendment if you're a public university. Under the First Amendment, we have developed over the past 100 years very, very well-established doctrines that even the most outrageous, noxious, terrible ideas and speakers will be protected, absent some certain factors like incitement to violence and so on. But our principle of freedom of speech and press encompasses really horrific ideas. That's been the course of the First Amendment over the past 100 years. It's unique in the world. It's not incontestable, but it is our approach, and it's really quite special in America. So private universities are not bound by the First Amendment, but we choose, generally speaking, to abide by the First Amendment, as I said, public universities must. In the case of Ahmadinejad, who was the president of Iran, the dean and faculty of the School of International and Public Affairs invited Ahmadinejad to come speak at Columbia. Remember, this is the School of International Affairs. This is the president of Iran. I think everybody realizes that he had taken positions and done things that happened under his government that were awful and horrific, violations of human rights, threats to other nations, including Israel, denial of the Holocaust. But he was invited to speak just as, we might want to confront people who have views that are important in the world because they're actually being said and done, but we want to address them through the academic mission. So he was invited to speak. It became extremely controversial. And I had to step in and defend the right of the school to invite the speaker. There was a principle that I believed in, but I could not back away from. Because it became so controversial, it was critical, in my view, that he not be able to come and just say what he would probably say and then leave without being challenged and questioned. So the question was who would challenge him, and I couldn't put that on anybody else. So I said that I would make the introduction and do that. I did so. He spoke. I think the event was unbelievably controversial. There were people who thought this was terrible to give this person a platform. Other people thought it was an ideal example of free speech. A speaker with terrible ideas is allowed to speak, but is also challenged and confronted, and was so by me, but also by students and faculty. It became a major event in the United States and even around the world, covered by all press, including satirical skits on Saturday Night Live and comedic covers on the New Yorker. Here was an instance, I think, where the First Amendment, as we have come to understand it and to apply it by both conservatives and liberal justices, played out on a university campus, even though there were many people, including many public officials, who made threats because they so disliked this. And it was, as I said, it was a very difficult moment, but that's what free speech is.
President Bollinger, do you feel that way 20 years later that it was a right decision to allow him to speak at Columbia?
So, two questions there. One is, was it a good idea to invite Ahmadinejad to speak at Columbia? And the second question would be, given that he was invited by a school with the legitimate academic reasons for doing so, was it right of the university and the president, me, to defend that? And on the latter, I am absolutely confident that was the right decision. On the former, I think one can take different views. I mean, we have choices under our free speech rights who to invite. We don't have to invite everybody. And I think reasonable people can take different views on that, but not on the latter.
In your book, you walk through the history of the First Amendment, writing, "The modern history of the First Amendment is one of the great American stories. It is a story of the 20th century, starting during and after World War I, a moment that witnessed the rise of communism and socialism as a global force." What was the impact of World War I on the First Amendment?
This is really, I mean, this is what I teach, what I love to teach and think about and write about. And most people don't realize that while the First Amendment was part of the Constitution right from the beginning in the 18th century, more or less the beginning, it was added after the formal Constitution was drafted and adopted. But the First Amendment was there from the start. It wasn't until 1919, in this kind of World War I revolutionary kind of period around the world, the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, and other movements, but World War I especially. It was in that context that the First Amendment was really defined. We began to define it in Supreme Court cases. There were three cases that came before the Supreme Court in 1919, all involving speakers who had said something critical of the war, about the United States policies in the war, and they were arrested and prosecuted and convicted of undermining the war effort. One of those people was actually a candidate for president of the United States, Eugene Debs. So this was not just your average dissenter. And the Supreme Court unanimously upheld the convictions. So that starts our First Amendment doctrines. It's not a very strong principle. Dissent is not secure. People who are disliked by the majority or by the government have no particular rights. And then very quickly, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., of course, one of the great justices in the United States history, who had written the opinions in those first three cases on behalf of a unanimous court, changed his position. And in one of the great decisions, one of the great opinions of all time, gave a completely different picture of what free speech should be. And he did really three things. One was to say the First Amendment is about our commitment in the society, in the nation, through the Constitution, to search for truth, to advance knowledge. And that's what we are committed to as a society. We're not committed to obedience to the government. We're not committed to belief in whatever beliefs are handed down to us. We're committed to searching for knowledge. And that is a core value that is reflected by the framers in the structure of the First Amendment and structure of the Constitution, notably in the First Amendment. So the goal was laid down as the search for truth and knowledge. The second thing that Holmes did, which is really quite remarkable, was to say, understand, we are not built in human nature naturally to pursue this end. We love our beliefs. We don't like people who believe differently. He actually said there is logic in the human nature to persecute people who believe differently from you. We don't like it when we're challenged and threatened, and so intolerance is our natural instinct. And what the First Amendment is about is overcoming that, being better at thinking through ideas, and that is necessary, a kind of intellectual character necessary to pursue this end of advancing knowledge. And then the third thing, which was played out also over the next 100 years, was that we're going to have a principle in the First Amendment that will protect even the most outrageous ideas. Uh, Ideas that 99% of us would regard as highly offensive, very dangerous, horrific ideas. We're going to protect against government censorship, in a sense, to highlight our commitment to the value of knowledge and our recognition that we are not, uh, we're not born to believe in this, and we have to master our bad tendencies to pursue this idea. And that framework became the framework for the next 100 years. It wasn't always successful in times of great stress, like the McCarthy period and the fears about communism. We did not live up to those ideals. And we're now in another period, in my view, where we're being tested on our commitments to free speech. But that framework became the basis for First Amendment for decades to come, for a century. A really stunning development, and one of the great achievements, as I say in the book, and Peter, one of the great achievements of the United States, emulated by democracies all across the world. And just like the modern research university or the modern university, which began at exactly the same time as the First Amendment, and these two ran in parallel. These are two of our greatest achievements, and I think most people, if asked what are great things we've accomplished, these would be listed as two. And my point now is that they need to be brought together even more than they have been. That is, the First Amendment needs to recognize the role of universities as very special institutions in advancing the goals of the First Amendment. And universities need to be more guarantors of the First Amendment freedom of speech as we've known it.
Lee Bollinger, when I think of freedom of speech in the Supreme Court, I often think of the 1977 Skokie situation where the ACLU defended the Nazis' right to march in a majority Jewish suburb of Chicago. You say that the First Amendment asks a lot of us. We're almost unique in the world today, aren't we, in the U.S., when it comes to defending the First Amendment?
We're unique in the world in the degree to which we protect speech under the mantle of freedom of speech and press and First Amendment. So that is right, Peter. No other country, no other democracy in the world today or in human history goes as far as we do in protecting ideas. And you're right, the Skokie case in that late 70s period was a really notable example of doing that. So, as you said, Skokie, suburb of Chicago, 40,000 citizens are Jewish. 4,000 of those are survivors of the concentration camps of World War II. And the small neo-Nazi group wants to conduct a march in that community, obviously to be as offensive as they can. And the courts, under doctrines that had now been well established, said that anti-Semitic speech, neo-Nazi speech, is protected under the First Amendment. The major case on this is Brandenburg versus Ohio from the late 1960s, when a group of Klan members met outside of a town in Ohio and brandishing arms and claiming that they will take revengeance against their wrong word, against African Americans and Jews, and that was protected according to the court. So these cases really solidified this approach that we have, this extreme protection, extreme commitment in the society to being open to ideas, even those we detest, legitimately so.
And C-SPAN's Q&A podcast continues in a moment. So fast forward to 2023, 3 university presidents lose their jobs, Columbia, Penn, and Harvard, over some of the protests that were being held on campuses. What was your take on that?
Well, again, is complicated because they're not the same in each instance. But in general, let me just say this. The hearings that were held in Congress with these speakers, I think represented several things. One was, I think we needed a much stronger defense of universities at the time. I don't want to be critical of these academic leaders. They were new to the job for the most part. They were inexperienced in this. And I think they were somewhat caught unawares. But one of the things we need in the society is a much more vigorous defense of freedom of the universities. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote this book, to do that. The second thing is that the issue that was front and center in those hearings was anti-Semitism happening on the campuses. And there's no doubt that there were instances of anti-Semitism and that these were deeply, deeply troubling. There are also instances of Islamophobia and other kinds of terrible speech. But anti-Semitism was absolutely a problem. These universities believed that this was a problem and were taking steps to address it, just as they should. And they would condemn this as much as anybody on that congressional committee or elsewhere. One of the things, however, that was not distinguished carefully in the hearings was, what actions can you take against anti-Semitic expression, and in what principles are at stake? So we've established, Peter, in our conversation here, that under the First Amendment, longstanding doctrines, that horrific speech like racist, anti-Semitic, sexist speech can be and is often protected under the First Amendment. And we've established that universities live by the First Amendment in discussions of public issues on the campuses. When people, in the course of protesting and debating public issues, engage in racist or anti-Semitic speech, other bad speech, if we follow the First Amendment, we cannot take action and should not take action against those individuals. We must explain why that is so, and we must always have reasons for our policies, and First Amendment and otherwise. And it was incumbent on universities to articulate the basis of not censoring speech that was anti-Semitic. And I don't think we did a particularly great job of that at the time. But it would be wrong for people to draw the conclusion that universities didn't care about anti-Semitic speech because they did not punish or censor speech, such speech in the course of protests. Speech outside of the context of public debate about public issues, one-on-one type of confrontations, in certain contexts, like residential halls, where it gets much more complex and there are limits to free speech, there you really can take action against anti-Semitic behavior. And universities, I think, were, trying their best, but they were also dealing with a situation that I think we were not well prepared for because our disciplinary procedures often were not well suited to this kind of crisis. That's a long and complicated kind of picture, but it captures all the kinds of distinctions that I think we need to make when we talk about what happened in that incident.
Lee Bollinger, you spent 6 years at the University of Michigan as president, 21 years at Columbia, one public, one private. How different were the parameters that you had to regulate through or manage through from a public to a private university?
Right. So I was 5 years as president of Michigan. I had been dean there at the law school for 7 years and a faculty member for some, 20 plus years. University of Michigan is one of the greatest public universities in the United States, just like Columbia is one of the greatest private universities in the United States. In their essence, if you walk onto the campuses, if you go to the classrooms, if you talk to faculty, the values that are held, the behavior of the people who work and live within these institutions, they're the same. Everybody, public or private, is trying to do their best to take their field and to add new knowledge to it and to teach young people in their respective fields. Where it becomes different, I think, is in the relationship to the government. So the public universities, of course, are creatures of the state in which they exist. And they have been formed by the state legislatures, in many cases, 100, 200 years ago, and have that kind of relationship with the governments in their own states. That is not really true of private universities. Private universities, as we started our discussion, Peter, have a relationship with government, but it's the federal government and it's the funding of the science and so on that is the relationship. So in a state university, a public university, you have to spend a lot of time making sure that your relationship with your state government is good, and also that the state government respects the autonomy of the university. So there are added dimensions to what public universities have to do to maintain their academic mission.
In your book, one of the things you do that I found really interesting is you walk through the structure of a university. We talked a little bit at the beginning about what a university president does, but what about the provost? What about the professors? How is a university managed and structured?
Yes, so I felt a need in the book to say universities are great institutions, among the greatest in the country, greatest in the world. But why is that so? And are they organized in ways that are quite special? And the answer is they're organized in really quite bizarre ways, and yet they have become these extremely successful institutions. So the primary authority within a university is with the faculty, and a faculty member, let's go back, a person who's thinking about being a faculty member in a university really is considering many options. You could go into business, you could go into nonprofits, you could go into finance, you could go into government. And in those choices, you have a lot of options to make more money or to have more power or to this or that. If you're going to go into a university, you're not going to make as much money as you could in other options, and you're not going to end up having an enormous amount of power. What you are going to have is the opportunity to study, learn, master as much as possible a field that is really, really interesting and important to you. And that may be Virginia Woolf, it may be the First Amendment, it may be quantum physics, quantum mechanics, it may be neuroscience. These are an array of subjects and fields that you have before you to choose. And if you do that, you want the freedom and you have the expectation, you want the freedom to create new ideas. You accept that. You spend 7 years basically proving that you have the potential to add new knowledge, and then you're given tenure for life. And that means you have a job for life. You control your teaching, you control your scholarship, you're part of a community, a school or a department and a university. But you really have a lot of autonomy in doing that. And your autonomy is not simply the way it works out is not simply I'll do what I want. You are also part of a community of people in your field, a few of whom will be within your university, but most of whom will be at universities across the country. And in my field, First Amendment, I have some colleagues at Columbia, and they're wonderful, and I love being with them and learning from them. But most of my colleagues are at every other institution in the country, and they are the ones that I look to for support, guidance, learning, and so on. So there are expectations of creativity, expectations of how you think, scholarly temperament, and expectations that you will teach young people in your field. That is the core of universities, and that is why they're so successful, because that world attracts some of the brightest people of every generation, not by any means all, but some of the brightest and most talented of any generation to spend their entire life, and that most of us do, in the university world doing these things. Universities then are governed by, a department, and they work on making sure that student needs are met for classes and that there's an intellectual exchange in a bigger field like law or history. And then there can be, a higher level than that with a dean, and the provost works at the central administration, and the president is at the top of this. And everyone is part of this academic world. I mean, university presidents are not chosen from outside; they're chosen from within this universe of faculty and people who have devoted their lives to this calling. So it's an incredible institution, organization, as I say in the book and often say, if you go to organizational theorists, no one would come up with a way the university is organized as a way to do it. And yet, uh, it has been incredibly successful over the past century and more.
Is it important, in your view, to have a ideologically diverse faculty?
So again, a very complicated question. In general, yes. I mean, if you go to an economics department, overwhelmingly the faculty will believe in a free market in one form or another. I mean, it may be more government regulation or less government regulation, but the overwhelming consensus of the faculty will be that a free market is the best. What about a Marxist economic? There's debates within economics departments about whether entire other views, universes of ideas should be brought in. Should we have more people who have conservative viewpoints? What are conservative viewpoints? The answer is generally yes. The more viewpoints and perspectives, the better. one does have to remember that we're not interested in simply hiring Democrats or Republicans, we're hiring scholars. So these have to be people who are dedicated to advancing their knowledge according to the scholarly temperament and putting up a scholarly result that can stand up in the academic community. So every department, I think, in a university where it's relevant, I mean, not relevant in math, whether you have a conservative viewpoint, or in biology necessarily, but in some fields, law and the like, which I, of course, am part of, and maybe some other sociology, political science. I mean, these are fields where there are different viewpoints across the political spectrum, and you do want to try to have scholars reflecting different viewpoints and perspectives. All that said, I am confident that virtually all faculty regard it as their responsibility when teaching or when doing their scholarship to do their best to reflect those other perspectives in the classroom and through their scholarship. It's just part of the ethos of what it means to be an academic. I mean, in my First Amendment class, it gives me great pleasure to present viewpoints and to argue for viewpoints that I don't hold myself. But that's not the point. My point of my class is not to teach them my viewpoints, it's to bring them into the array of viewpoints that makes the field that make the field so exciting.
What's your take on websites like Rate Your Professor?
Well, I mean, I think one of the developments of the past 50 years, and it really doesn't go back much further than that, has been the voice of students in evaluating the teaching that they experience, the classes, the courses, and so on. And I'm a big fan of students being able to articulate their views. I read my student evaluations very carefully. And so I think it's terrific that students find ways to express their voices, and that we advance those to the community so that everybody gets to know them.
List price at Columbia about $100,000 a year for everything. After 4 years, what? How do you measure success for that student?
So, I mean, this is where we get into, again, complex areas of how do we think about universities. I begin, Peter, by saying my deepest belief is that universities help the nation to fulfill its mission, its goal, its values of preserving and advancing knowledge and bringing every new generation into that mission. And I think that the success of universities is to be gauged and judged by that mission. And that is not something that you can represent by taking the income of students who graduate and then pursue careers, or the average income. It's not a business that we're doing, and it's not just preparing people for a career. And I'm not saying, I don't want to be taken as saying that career interests are irrelevant, and so they are, and we do think about them and should think about them. But it is this intellectual character. It is, are we a society made up of people who want to have knowledge and build new knowledge and seek truth, and to do it collectively, and all the benefits to a democracy, to a way of life, to medical benefits, health benefits, to the way we communicate. I mean, all these things are linked to our commitment to knowledge, but that commitment by itself is an end in itself. And so I want to know, when students graduate, did you build your own capacity to be part of this mission? And are you prepared for it in your life? And will you participate in that? And will you benefit from it yourself? That is really it's somewhat vague, and it's somewhat amorphous and intangible, but most of life that's meaningful is intangible and amorphous. And if we try to reduce everything to what is your salary prospects as a result of attending a great university, we are really missing the point, and worse.
And Lee Bollinger closes his book with a quote from Michel de Montaigne, the 16th century French philosopher: "There is no desire more natural than the desire for knowledge." Lee Bollinger is the author of this book, University: A Reckoning, former president of Columbia, former president of the University of Michigan, and our guest for the past hour on C-SPAN. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
And thanks for joining us for the Q&A podcast. Next week, we talk with Doug Mills, photographer for the New York Times, who's covered presidents from Ronald Reagan to Donald Trump.